My name is Jamesha Fisher. I am a DevOps security pirate. I don't like the name engineer, but you take what you're given. I work at CloudPassage, and we do security for the cloud, but more specifically, we do security plus automation, which equals awesome. What I'm here to discuss today is DevOpsSec and why that is important through the deployment of ChefServer. So before we go into the deployment process and the planning and the testing, I have one question for you to think about. And that is, why is security DevOps? Or also known as DevOpsSec. And that's something important to consider because many teams don't consider it. It's mostly an afterthought, or it's thought of as something that might slow a team down because there's so much red tape when we think about security. But it actually isn't the case. So just before diving in, catch my breath. So just like DevOps is important today, and it's a growing need for companies to automate and be fast, so is security. It is in the public eye more than ever. You have brand name vulnerabilities like Heartbleed. Now, if I can get a show of hands, how many people had to revoke and renew certificates when that came out? Like with a quickness. Or talk about shell shock. When all you Mac users were like, okay, now we suddenly have to take a Mac update moment and actually, for once in a while, reboot our machines, because I know we hardly ever do it. Sometimes I don't. And Windows users, they're like, oh no, this doesn't affect me unless I have Cygwin, and then like you're totally screwed. So this was not just anything like throw up a security advisory. This hit mainstream. This went all across social media, went into the news, was on CNN. It was kind of crazy. So now it's more in the public eye. You also have breaches of various industries. Who wasn't affected by insurance breaches with a specific insurance company, which I won't name? Or, different types of retail, when you used your credit card and it's like, oh, wait, that shop I use, it got popped. Or even the entertainment industry is getting hit by this. I mean, when back in last year when the movie Black Hat came out, suddenly I was talking with actors who suddenly were more aware of security now more than ever due to the Sony hack. So that also leads to how this turns into digital fraud and crimes. Most people who have those breaches, it leads to stuff that affects people in real time. For instance, the insurance breach. A day later, all of a sudden, tax fraud was occurring with people's information that's being stolen from insurance companies. Or things happening in real time and affecting people from hacking, like I had recently went to a high school where I talked with 16-year-olds, and they were like, what is a DDoS? And what is all this hacking with the Twitter hacking and cyberbullying? What's all this about? And I'm like, how do you even know about DDoS? Like, how do you even know about all these terms that like I went to school for? So it's becoming more clear day by day that security is an issue, and it's an issue that people in the real world care about and also are affected by. So another thing, with this all being important, as well as DevOps being important, it also means that DevOps also fits security in a way, or security fits into those DevOps principles. To give you an example, most security people know about the information security triad, which is composed of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I'm just going to go through each of them and show you how DevOps kind of matches up with each of these principles. So let's start off with availability. For any information system to serve its purpose, the information must be available when it's needed. So what does this mean for DevOps? It means that The information or data or product that we serve must come fast. We need it always up, always available. And on that note, we also need to ensure that it's always up, that if there is an issue, we fix it before it affects the user. Whether it's an abnormality, whether it's a DDoS attack that we know about and we can automatically load more nodes to handle the load, we always seek to ensure that we have fast uptime and we have it and we weather the storms without issue. Integrity. That a system and its data are not manipulated for unauthorized functionality or alteration. So what does that mean to DevOps? That systems are repeatable and standardized. Because once you have a repeatable system and it's standardized, you're able to detect problems. You're able to ensure that fast uptime because you know, hey, something is out of the ordinary with this pattern because usually the machine works this way. It's also able to be audited and processed. Because we have a repeatable and standardized process, we're also able to enforce policy. We're able to make sure the machine is built with the exact specifications without the vulnerabilities. And if we do have the vulnerabilities, we're able to upgrade them as such or detect when the vulnerability is there. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is the requirement that private or confidential information not be disclosed to unauthorized individuals. So what does that mean in the DevOps frame? That while we have systems that allow users to be collaborative and be able to access the Chef tools in order to get things done and process things with a fast uptime and make things repeatable and auditable, that we don't silo it. We allow just enough control, but at the same time don't hamper the process, or at least find a compromise if you can. I know a lot of the times security people, we kind of look at things and say, okay, we need this because we need to be compliant under this, without considering, hey, can we do a risk assessment? Hey, can we do other mitigative measures to make sure that the process flows? Which is much like the collaborative DevOps process when we're sitting down and talking and trying to get a plan together. So why is this important when we're deploying a Chef server? Whether we're starting out with a new install or doing a migration. It's important because the DevOps process itself is very collaborative, and at the same time, we still have the issues of dealing with security as well as getting a product out that's fast and reliable. And if we expect that out of our products, why not expect the same out of our tools? So it also needs to go through that process. So right now, I'm going to walk you through each of the steps of the way using the triad that I presented earlier, starting with planning, and specifically availability when planning. So when thinking about availability, you have all these questions. But the most important question that you think of when doing security is, how quickly do you recover? And that's something that is different for each individual company. They have to do their own risk assessment on how much risk they can take with having the Chef server down. With having the Chef server down due to a networking issue, or having the Chef server down due to a Zen vulnerability coming out and there's massive reboots and you're just like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? You have to assess whether you can take that hit. And then from there, knowing what to do. Now with the new setup of, now with considering their setup or configuration of Chef server, after you consider the risk and how much you are willing to take downtime for, you pick out a layout. And there's 3 different ones that you can choose from. There's the single box, a single tier, where you have both your front end and your back end. There's the scaled front end, where you just have one single back end, or you have the high availability option, which is scalable on the back end, but you can either do one front end server or many. Now, the option that my company chose was the single back end with multiple front ends. And that's because we are in the cloud. We mostly use primarily virtualized systems. And one of the things that people warned me about, including Chef Folk, is, oh, you're using virtual, don't use DRBD at all, which is, sorry, I have to look at my notes. A distributed replicated block device, or DRBD. And so after talking with them and talking with my team, and they were like, nope, we don't want to deal with it, we went ahead and went with data backup and Chef Cookbook option. Now, I just found out today that actually there are some people out there who have been able to manage to use DRBD with virtualized systems. So whoever that person is, talk to me again today, because I would love to hear from you. The next thing we're going to talk about, once you have your availability planned and what type of infrastructure you're going to use, and you have the specs out, you're going to talk about integrity. And the thing you think about with integrity is, 1, how do we configure the servers? How are we going to configure Chef Server in order for it to be secure? How are we going to configure access? And the answer I have for you is to automate. And usually you can automate in 2 ways to set this up. You can either automate using Chef Client without a host, like Chef Solo or Chef Zero. Or if you're migrating from an old server to a new one, you can do the little hacky way, which is use the old Chef server to configure the new one. And what else? Also, you have to consider the standards and security after you've configured it. After you've configured the access through the cookbook, whichever way you do. And the way to ensure that is to basically use security tools. And that can vary depending on what you want out of it. It can be something that's chefized, especially in terms of firewalls, which I'm going to talk about next. Or it can be a tool or a service like CloudPassage. We do software vulnerability assessment, as well as configuration security monitoring, which are 2 of the important things to ensure the integrity of a system and allow security to check in, as well as ops to see the same thing. So security can be like, hey, I'm seeing this on the machine, and we can basically be like, oh, what machine? And then just look at it. So allowing something that is ensuring standards and security, but at the same time, still allowing that collaborative process between security and ops if needed. Additionally, we're talking about firewalls as well on the configuration side. 2 points I'd like to add to that. 1, remember that you're focusing on inbound and outbound for ops people unfamiliar with that. And sometimes it can be very strict. So you want to test, because some of the documentation, though it has the basic ports, some others might be opened. Additionally, the loopback interface, there's services that run on that. So you want to make sure that you have that open. Otherwise, the configuration, the initial configuration won't work. As I ran into, and it kind of stopped me for a couple weeks, because I was like, why isn't this working? Shouldn't this thing do what it's supposed to? And then only to realize, oh yeah, I didn't have this port open for RabbitMQ or ER Chef or anything at all in the loopback interface. So I was like, okay. So once we have the configuration of, once we have the planning done for the availability as well as the integrity, and we know what tool we're going to use, and we know how we're going to configure things, the last thing is confidentiality. So when we're thinking about confidentiality, the questions we want to ask ourselves: 1, how do we want to structure our Chef server? And it all depends on the version that you want to use. So for us, we went with Chef Enterprise because we wanted the possibility of using different organizations. This is different from the regular environment organizations, which is normal for some people. But the org, it does give good separation in case you're more doing service-based for clients and they want that absolute security. But at the same time, it causes a whole lot more overhead and workflow, especially if you're migrating from using environments to just using organizations. So it's something that you'll have to choose based off of what your company needs are. For environment, it's the most default. It's the most that the tools use, so there's not much of a change in workflow. Though you still have to keep in mind to keep a workflow there, otherwise you could cause issues such as, overwriting environments or making some changes that you don't mean to because you're in a single org. And the last thing, how are you going to deploy? Are you going to deploy using a brand new install, and then you're fresh out the gate and you're like, I'm ready, I'm rocking to go, I'm going to add all these agents to this new server? Or are you migrating? Are you migrating from an old server to Chef 12? Or in our case, migrating from open source Chef 10 to Chef 12? Based off of that, you want to, make a plan for that. Whether you want to migrate to a new machine or whether you want to upgrade. And lastly, how are users going to access? Are they going to access just by the API alone? Or if you're an enterprise user, are you primarily going to limit them to just the interface? Also, what roles are they going to have? Are they going to have any access to specific roles that will allow them to change cookbooks or update cookbooks or view cookbooks? With Chef 12, that is something new with role-based access and being able to, enforce those policies. Additionally, they also have LDAP authentication, but it's still a bit spotty. We ended up not using it because it didn't directly integrate well with LDAP, and for us, the specific version that we're using, if the LDAP server went down, you'd have to use a key lock, and we were like, that's too much work. Might as well just, have the split different keys and, deal with it that way. It might have changed, though, since I made this talk, so sorry, Chef folk. So now that you have all your planning done, you have all the availability planned, you have your integrity and how you're going to test for it, and you have the confidentiality to set up users and how you're going to make that happen, now you test. And when I say test, you prep for it and you practice what you're going to run into while running Chef Server. So when we're talking about basic availability, you're talking about building the host and setting up the server. That means SSL certs too, because in Chef 12, it's a requirement to use HTTPS. If you try to use anything else, I'm not going to say that it's hard, but I'm not going to say that it's easy either. So if you have SSL certs, set those up. Ensure that the minimum amount of authorized users can log in. You don't want to open it out the gate while you're still testing. So QA and operations folks, or whoever needs to be involved in the process. So that may include security, that may include product, but make it the minimum amount. And throughout that, you want to just test the basic operations and worst cases. So if the server goes down, what happens and how you're going to jump back from that depending on what deployment and repeatable process you use to configure servers. You want to test to see if that works, or if you spinning up another server works, or if you back up something, it works. So once you have all that tested, you also at the same time want to test for integrity. So when you check for software vulnerabilities through your assessment, or monitor for configuration inconsistencies using configuration software management, more than our tool uses this, by the way. You want to check for that when you first set up the server, when you're testing, as well as post-setup, to see if there are any differences or inconsistencies. You also want to verify that your firewall rules work and that SSL is valid and set up. You also want to check for, again, any results from the software vulnerability assessments and configuration management, and collaborate with your security team on, okay, what do we update? Oh, the kernel update, it's kind of important, let's update it. You want to work with the team to make sure that the configuration you're giving is, again, standardized and repeatable. So after you've done that, after you've gone through worst case scenarios, after you've kind of standardized, after doing various testing for consistency, you then go into confidentiality. And this is where you kind of ease up on the minimum amount of users. You create the organizational setup that you ideally see. You create the users and role-based access, and you test authentication and basic operations with users and roles and what operations they're going to do depending on the team and role that they're on, and make sure that works. And now, after you're done with all of that, after you've done all the planning and all the testing and making sure that everything works and then standardized and repeatable, you then go into deployment, which should be a breeze unless you forgot something in the planning and testing phase. And after that, I don't know what to tell you, just work hard. So things to keep in mind when you're deploying. Chef cookbooks are your friends when dealing with clients, whether they're new or you're migrating them, specifically the Chef Client and Omnibus Updater cookbooks. We did not have these two cookbooks implemented at the time when we migrated, but I sure as heck implemented them before we migrated over. They were really helpful in making the change from one server to another, because we did spin up a new server and migrate to that one. It did make things easier when changing the URLs. There is a chef server URL attribute which we added, which made the switch very, very easy. Omnibus Updater kept the versions consistent, so we didn't have any weirdness. And again, we kept stuff standardized and repeatable. For new installs, for you new folk, it's going to take some time and adjustment. For even migrations, it might take some new time and adjustment, but a little bit more so for the new installs. For migrations, to save on time, it'll probably be a good idea to download and move from the old Chef server. I can personally tell you that, yes, it will save you a lot of time, because I did something differently. And yeah, it took a long time to do it to another machine and then upload it again. So do it from the old Chef server if you're going to do the download and upload to the new one. Additionally, if you're going from an environment-based chef kind of structure to an organization one, move everything first and then separate. It'll make things much easier and planning won't get too complicated. So, in conclusion, coming back to availability, integrity, and confidentiality, With availability, you always want to plan for recovery, and you want to test setup and basic operations at least when we're speaking of security and DevOps. When speaking of integrity, you want to plan for the repeatable and enforceable. And check for security, always. For confidentiality, you want to plan out your chef org, as well as the roles and users. And you also want to test for their operability and making sure that they fit. And in this way, by doing all this, you plan to not only do DevOps in the right way, but do it securely and do it with security. Yep.
Before we go to questions, we found out we did some scurrying back behind the scenes. We can run your demo if you'd like to run that. So tech over here is going to get your computer hooked up.
Okay.
If I could get this mic on, there we go. And let's take some Q&A while he's getting you hooked up.
Okay.
And we'll go from there. Any questions? Yes.
After you went through your process of setting up a Chef server and securing it, did you run a vulnerability scan or assessment against it? And if so, what kind of tools did you use for that?
So as you'll see in the demo, we used our own product, Halo, in order to run the software vulnerability assessment as well as the configuration assessment to see if anything's wrong. I also worked with the team on that. Additionally, our security team also has a Nessus box, which they run, and other tools as well, which I can't mention. Probably already got in trouble for the Nessus box thing, but oh well. But that's pretty much what we run, and then after that, I work with the security team to make sure that everything's insured. And this is for each and every service that we bring up. I mean, when we're testing out new services, when we were testing out new Git management tools, we did the same thing where we had them run through it. I remember we were testing out a new tool, and just security looked at it, and they were like, oh, really, guys? We have to use this, but we were able to secure it and, you know, mitigate proper risk and add things to it. Yeah.
All right, next question. Here's the mic.
I apologize. I missed some at the beginning, so maybe I missed this. But could you talk a little bit more about how, in terms of culture between the security and operational aspects and dev teams, like was this a difficult transition for you, or is this something that the security team was really on board with, or did it take time for everyone to come to terms with, or how did that work?
I think for us as an organization, it was easier because we're a security company first and foremost. So that's one thing we had to get together on. And so it came easy to that way because we all had to think in the mind, okay, we're making a security product, so we obviously have to make sure first and foremost that we have security. So to answer your question, yes, the transition was easy, but there's still some bumps in the road. Sometimes we do end up having some scuffles with security. Sometimes they're like, oh, we need this compliance, but then we kind of have to sit down and have a conversation with them. And usually our security team, they're like the greatest bunch of guys in the world, and they're really, really open to things. So it's rarely a moment that we run into them and they're like, no. So, you know, it's good to have that type of team there too, so.
Got another question from this gentleman right here.
Yep.
Did you use any of the hardening cookbooks against the Chef server, or do you use any of them at all? And if you did you have any kind of challenges with dealing with that?
So he asked, did I use any hardening cookbooks? And if so, were there any hardships? No, I did not. Most of the hardening stuff that we have for our basic machines, I trust in, but most of them were made before I got there. And after that, it's using the tools to check for integrity. I am trying to standardize more the chef cookbook server roles and look more into that, and hopefully we can add something to the chef server cookbook.
Yeah. Can't see it.
Yep.
Next question's over here.
Yep.
So for the automation environments, let's say either Elastic or where it's not administrator present, what are your recommendations for protecting the keys, like the validator key?
Can you repeat that again?
So for environments that there is not a human presence, let's say you have an Elastic in a cloud component, creating machines and configuring them, what are your recommendations to secure the chef secrets, like the validator key, and avoid being spoofed or stolen or things like that?
That is actually something I don't have a real good answer for at the moment without giving some stuff away. I would say look in the Chef Vault. That's something that we were considering as far as management, and the Nordstrom guys are pretty awesome.
Chef Vault only works after you did the bootstrap. I'm talking about the thing before that.
Beforehand. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay.
All right, then perfect timing. Let's go into the demo.
So here I have test server I set up, Oneida. And this is the front end. I have a front end and a back end set up. And for this, I have CloudPassage's product Halo, which I use to manage firewalls and do everything that needs to be done. So since this is, I'm going to show you the back-end policy. So since this is mostly a simply set up for a demo, I'm kind of lax on the rules. But this is the rules that we add in case I add any host to that server group that you saw earlier. But it's just checking to make sure that they're sound and okay. Going back to this. You also have the information for the host, as well as whether a firewall is assigned, any security events, the security accounts it has, the configuration scan, which shows the configuration issue based off of a policy I set up. I'm using a default template for the core software scan, which shows packages that I need to update that are critical and non-critical based off of any CVEs. I can also do file integrity monitoring and log-based intrusion, but intrusion detection. But for now, I'm just focusing on these two. Let's see. Additionally, I wanted to show, okay. So I wanted to show the setup that we have, but of course I can't show all of it because my screen is off. So basically this is a basic tour tier setup. As you can see, I have the front end and the back end VIP and the front end server, as well as the SSL configuration. This is something that they don't show basically in the documentation, but if you look in the detailed server.rb configs, you can figure out how to set up the SSL certificate and key, as well as the country and state name, so that it has all the proper information that it needs. And that's pretty much what I have of the demo, which I wanted to show in the testing part. So does anybody else have any questions?
We've got one over here coming to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for showing that. The question I had was which part would I see OpenSSL being in a bad state on my Chef server? There was a part of the user interface that looked like the software scan, maybe, or
you mean the SSL certificate, or
that I have the old version of OpenSSL. Like say I have Heartbleed.
That would be. Let me bring that up again. So. So if I go to more details, wrong one. So if I go to more details in the software scan, it shows all the firmware. As you can tell, this is a very, very unpatched server. But it shows the version of OpenSSL and all the CVEs related to it.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah, I know. Please do not follow this demo and what I've done. It's very last minute.
All right, looks like we've got one more question in the front.
I'm not sure if this is something that is specific to CloudPassage or not, but with all of those CVEs there, is that just for people to click through and learn more about, or are there actual remediations possible from here, or?
Remediations possible from here, no, but we also have an API that makes it easier to look through. We also have a way to print out the reports so that they're more easily readable.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We've got time for one more question. Looks like we're questioned out. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.